Hi, welcome back. In this part, we're going to continue our discussion of how accurate the Killing Fields movie is with its depiction of what happens on the grounds of the French embassy. But first, let's establish the actual context. As we saw last time, amongst the chaos of all of Phnom Penh's residents being told to evacuate the city, the film focused on the group of journalists who, when they went back to their hotel, were told to take refuge in the French embassy just to the north of where they were staying. On the grounds of the French embassy, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 people were seeking asylum. This included about 500 French nationals, around 300 other foreigners, and perhaps more than 1,000 Cambodian nationals. Amongst that number was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Khmer Republic, Sirik Matak. Within a few days, it was communicated to those within the embassy that the Khmer Rouge were not going to treat the embassy as foreign soil. They requested that all Cambodian nationals joined the evacuation of the city, and in particular, called for any prominent officials hiding in there. By the 20th, these requests were carried out, and all of the Cambodians, including Dith Pran, had left the embassy. For the foreigners that remained, it would take another 10 days or so before they were put onto trucks and driven to Thailand, which takes another 3 days or so. So how close does the movie get to these real events? What did the filmmakers change? What did they keep the same? What didn't they decide to show? Why does the real Al Rockof hate this part of the movie so much? And have you ever wondered what happened to the real Dith Pran right after he left the embassy? So just like last time, we're going to use multiple sources to check how close the movie gets to the source material it's based on, including The Death and Life of Dith Pran by Sidney Schanberg, but much more detail about the experiences in the French embassy can be found in John Swain's memoir, River of Time, and Francois Bizot's memoir, The Gate. We also have evidence that was brought before the Khmer Rouge tribunals, including witness testimony by Sidney Schanberg and Al Rockof, as well as a set of telegrams that was sent out by the head of the French embassy, Jean Dirac. So let's get started.
I need some time to think.
I got no time to give this.
Now, we will go through this scene by scene in a moment, but before that, if you've seen the film, I just want to ask you a question. When you were watching what happened in the embassy, how long did you think it was between our characters arriving and the scene showing the tearful departure? Between here and here. Was it a few days? Was it a week? Was it longer than that? What was the impression that you got? When I was younger, I certainly got the impression from the film that it was a longer time, at least a week. But as I said earlier, all of the Cambodians leave the embassy by the 20th of April, which is basically just 2.5 days after they all got there. But Dith Pran is still present in the movie when the journalists are apparently going to be getting in the trucks to Thailand in the morning, which happened on the 30th of April. This is one of the biggest changes the filmmakers made, where they looked to condense the almost 3 weeks that all of the foreigners were still in the embassy and include the forced removals of the Cambodians, but also making it so that the Dith Pran character remains where the drama is for a longer period. But, just like the last video, I'm aware that we're talking about a movie here, not a historical essay, so it would be expected that the timing and sequence of events would be changed to make it more watchable. But overall, it is a change that is underlying the whole French embassy section of the film, and after all, that is the point of these videos, to highlight these kinds of discrepancies.
The Khmer Rouge appear to have attempted a mass evacuation of the entire population. Radio contact with the French embassy reveals that some 200 Europeans and an undisclosed number of Cambodians have taken refuge there.
This part begins with a radio announcement that explains that the Khmer Rouge were removing the population from the city. Radio dialogue like this has been used throughout the movie so far, even from the first scene, to explain the background in 1973 and the Watergate scandal. But in the French embassy scenes, the radio becomes much more prominent, explaining to the audience and the characters what is going on outside. This was the case for many of those in the grounds of the embassy, and the radio became their only source of information. So here we see Schamberg speaking with his driver Sarun, and we get a view of the grounds and see these asylum seekers within their own country. This is as reasonably accurate as it can be here, and actually highlights something that isn't explained in the film. So the French had dictated that all of the Cambodians who had fled in were to stay on the grounds surrounding the embassy, whereas the foreigners found places to stay within the various buildings and rooms. This division was criticised, and it looks pretty bad. One of the reasons the French gave was that they felt from the earliest time that it was likely that the Khmer Rouge would demand the Cambodian nationals leave. They felt that these asylum seekers had marked themselves as distrusting of the Khmer Rouge, and this would therefore mark them as enemies of the new regime. We see this, for instance, in Francois Bizot's memoir. One thing that we don't really see, because it probably would have been hard and expensive to shoot, is just how many people were there. For instance, we don't see the dozens of French residents of Phnom Penh that had driven their cars onto the grounds of the embassy and were sort of living in them like makeshift tents. We only get a fraction of the at least 1,000 Cambodians are there, as well as the foreigners who number in, 500 French and 300 sort of other foreigners. We only get a sort of glimpse at the real number. John Swain wrote that the whole embassy grounds resembled a giant campsite. In my opinion, the movie also does not give enough attention to the embassy gate, as it is depicting the days immediately after the journalists made it onto the grounds. The movie could have kept showing the masses of people that continued to walk to their unknown fate in the countryside. Progress was very slow, and those in the embassy remembered seeing a constant stream of people for days. Perhaps 2 million people were still making their way out of the city, and for those who were heading north, many of them continued to try and get into the embassy. The titular gate from Bizot's memoir, for him this represented the physical barrier between life and death, and this would become even more tragically emphasised when it became necessary to not only tell those begging to come in that they must keep going, but that even those within the grounds would soon have to be sent back through this gate. The physical gate itself has been kept and was moved into the gardens of the renovated French embassy where it remains today. In the film, we kind of see the gate looking like this, but we initially don't see Cambodians going past it, we see Russians coming into it. This is kind of left for the audience to figure out, but the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK, Pol Pot's revolutionary movement, they were aligned with China, whereas their Vietnamese neighbours, the Vietnamese Workers' Party, they had aligned themselves more with the Soviets. However, the Soviets and the Chinese had been on pretty bad terms for almost 20 years by this point. This was known as the Sino-Soviet split, and if you're interested in knowing more about that kind of stuff, then I can recommend you listen to the podcast where we go into this in a few different episodes. But what this scene is trying to get across is that ambassadors from a few of those different embassies had also been forced to leave and forced in with the foreigners at the French embassy. None of the memoirs I've read talked about a suitcase with sausages spilling out of it upon their arrival. However, they did mention that these kinds of communist representatives did bring plenty of supplies in their luggage and weren't keen on sharing at all. This was particularly annoying as the food situation did become quite dire, as the movie depicts.
In Thailand, Hugh Elder.
In Cambodia, why did they get this crap?
Now, here we get a few scenes which show us what the Westerners were doing in their new surroundings. Playing saxophone, sort of relaxing, having some drinks and some smokes. This is quite accurate. People remembered having this moment of levity, particularly after the chaos of the last few days, and for the journalists, their recent abduction. In Swain's memoir, he states that champagne and scotch was liberated from the embassy cellars, and that there was a piano around that people could enjoy. And there was a bit of boredom, not much to do, so people just sort of relaxed and had a chat and had a few drinks.
Do you see that guy across the gate there? The little guy? Could we not all look at once, please? I have it on reliable sources that that's none other than Hugh Elder.
You're kidding.
He's disguised, but I got a little suspicious about it.
And here we get this great little scene where they talk about a BBC journalist disguised as a chicken. I actually did some looking around for this Hugh Elder journalist. I couldn't find anything except quotes from this movie, so I presume it's a made-up person, which is kind of strange because at the very end of the movie, Schanberg references a real-life journalist, Henry Kalm, who doesn't appear in the movie, so they were happy to use a real name there, but they didn't want to here. I'm not sure why.
You know what I mean?
How does he get a copy out?
How does he get his copy out?
Right.
Specially trained hands.
John Malkovich's performance is really great here. The real Al Rockof was, is remembered as this big character, and he had actually even almost died just a year or so prior in Vietnam, where some shrapnel had pierced his heart or something similar. And here we get to see them probably smoking weed, not cigarettes. A lot of the memoirs, including Schanberg's, relay how common it was that they were smoking marijuana.
Yeah, the BBC has commissioned them to walk past the Khmer Rouge like they're regular fowl.
I also love this line, regular fowl. That's just a personal favourite for me.
Reports say that the Khmer Rouge are demanding that any officials of the defeated Lon Nol government, especially the so-called 6 traitors of the cabinet, be handed over to them. It is not known whether any of the ex-government ministers...
The relaxation is ended abruptly when the radio explains that senior officials from the previous government are on the grounds and the Khmer Rouge are demanding they come out. Immediately we see the results of this. What is being shown is the removal of Sirik Matak, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Khmer Republic. He was one of the top leaders of the government, particularly after Lon Nol basically fled the country in early April. And it was actually Lon Nol and Sirik Matak that had sort of worked together to produce the coup that removed Matak's royal prince cousin, Sihanouk, from power in 1970. Now, this is actually the first major departure from the historical reality that the film makes. As I said earlier, the timing will kind of be this ongoing thing throughout this discussion, but for instance here, Sirik Matak is apparently leaving first, or the least we could say is that he's leaving before Pran. This didn't happen. In reality, Sirik Matak felt as a leading official that he would have a legitimate right of asylum in the French embassy. However, the Khmer Rouge had presented the French with a list of people they wanted out, and they threatened to come in and get them if they didn't present them themselves. So the French didn't want that. They feared that violence would break out, so they went along with this. Most accounts say that Sirik Matak was clearly petrified as he left, but tried to put on a brave face. A Khmer Rouge representative met him at the gate, gave him a hug, led him to sit in a jeep, and he was driven away, and he was never seen again. He was likely killed at the Cercle Sportif, like a few other senior officials had been, or perhaps at the Olympic Stadium, or some other designated killing ground that the Khmer Rouge had set up in the city. Now, the timing of Sirik Matak's departure, and the rest of the Cambodians in the embassy actually, is made clear in a telegram that Jean Dirac sent to the French Foreign Ministry that day. The first telegram he sent said that communications with the Khmer Rouge had secured the safe removal of the Cambodian nationals who had taken refuge in the embassy, with the exception of some figures from the former regime who will join another group. So that was received at 11:55 a.m, and then another telegram was sent closer to 3 o'clock, which said that Sirik Matak had been collected at the embassy gates. So a large group, and then a few hours later, Sirik Matak leaves too. And that's all dated here on the 20th of April. Multiple sources conveyed this sequence of events, and the telegram confirms them. So the majority of Cambodians find out they have to leave on the 20th, most of them do, Sirik Matak later that afternoon. We'll touch on this more in a moment, but while the movie does basically get this around the wrong way, my sympathies are with the screenwriter here. When I was researching for my book, it actually is kind of hard to find really good sources which lay out the dates. And Schanberg's are actually some of the worst for it. he mentions Sirik Matak leaving without giving a time or day it happened, and he kind of describes it amongst just other general descriptions of the French embassy grounds soon after they arrive. So you kind of get this impression that it happened quite quickly. Other sources from him seem to be kind of off by about a day. He'll often say that the Cambodians left on the 21st. So I'm going to go with the sources that all confirm each other. Swain kept a diary day by day, so that's a much clearer source. Bizot has something similar. And of course we have this telegram, which confirms both of those. So they corroborate each other, and I'm happy to go with those sources.
Just a kilometre further? No. The only sense I can make of it, Sid, is that there's some sort of internal power struggle going on. Thanks. Different groups seem to be holding different parts of the city, and they all appear to be equally nervous of losing whatever power and control they have.
Next, we get a scene that makes it seem like it's the next day. Now, perhaps just due to the change in light and colour, but I don't know about you, I certainly get the impression from that some time has passed. Now, the audience becomes privy to a conversation with this gentleman who gives us an insight into what he thinks is going on in the city right now, something he describes as a power struggle. Now, this is actually a really big topic to get into, so I'll be quite brief, but check out the podcast if you're interested in that kind of thing. But within the first few days of the Khmer Rouge taking Phnom Penh, there had been this sort of multiple pincer movements from different zone leaders who all had their own sort of military forces under their command. And when they took the city, there was no central leader yet. Pol Pot didn't arrive in the city until the 20th. So you could imagine it split, into quarters, for instance. And along those borders, there were some sporadic clashes between the different Khmer Rouge forces. However, all of that was quickly put to rest once the central leadership arrived and started planning the next steps of the revolution, which, as I said, Pol Pot arrives on the 20th of April and sets up with the other leaders in the railway station, not too far from the French embassy, in fact. Now, the slight issue I have with this in the movie is not that he says it here. He's actually sort of right. If this is supposed to be depicting that first weekend after the fall of Phnom Penh, then yes, he's more than correct to say what he was thinking here. However, the movie actually emphasizes this again later in the movie, and I do worry that it gives the impression of an inherently chaotic political movement, that the Khmer Rouge were factional and full of power struggles for the entire time. Now, this is a larger historical debate, but let's just say that the Khmer Rouge leadership themselves would attempt to later defend their actions, excusing vast purges of their own party members, as well as vast numbers of the population, under this notion that they were just trying to defend themselves from these various power struggles. The leadership, Pol Pot and Nguyen Chea, were paranoid and ordered many of their own party to be killed. However, real evidence of power struggles and schemes against them is somewhat lacking, particularly on the scale that the movie implies here. The movement itself was highly centralized and was able to command a degree of control over the entire country.
Sydney, the Cambodians have to leave the embassy. They want all our passports and everybody downstairs. And the Cambodians out.
No!
Now, in this scene, we also find out, as this French person tells Swain, that all of the Cambodians would also have to leave. Seemingly, everyone finds out this development at once, and the accompanying drama, set to Mike Oldfield's score, is heart-wrenching. This is a great representation of the reality, as not only were the Cambodians being told they had to leave, But this news was going to break up numerous families that did not have the proper documentation for one or the other to stay. Ad hoc adoptions and marriages did occur, and in one particularly grim instance, one Cambodian who was in the embassy approached one of the Western doctors and asked him to euthanize himself and his family because he was so terrified of what might happen when they left the embassy. In reality, all of this news that they all had to go was communicated to them early on Sunday morning, about 7:30 in the morning. Francois Bizot, an ethnographer who had spent a long time in Cambodia, had become the primary person of contact between the Khmer Rouge managing what was going on in the embassy. He could speak fluent Khmer and was probably one of the only people remaining in the country that had had previous experience dealing with the communists. In the early years of the Civil War, he had been captured and imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge. They assumed he was a spy. He was taken to M13, which was basically a jungle prototype of what would become S21, otherwise known as Tuol Sleng. And unlike almost all of the other foreigners that had been caught by the Khmer Rouge, Bizot was eventually released. And years later, he too was in the embassy and became the one that was communicating with them. He passes on to the staff what was going to happen, and this is how they all find out about the Khmer Rouge directive.
You know, Pran is not gonna last 5 minutes out there, John. The Khmer Rouge have killed every f***ing journalist they've ever caught. Now, does Sid know how serious this is?
Of course he bloody
Because
knows.
we can't just let him walk out of here.
Look, 2 passports. This one's out of date, but the visa's valid. John Anquetil Brewer Swain.
Okay, so here we have the start of the Great Caper. Rockof explains that the Khmer Rouge have killed every journalist they've ever got their hands on, which is pretty much true. Listeners to the podcast might have heard the recent episode I did with Elizabeth Becker, who was there, covered the Civil War. One of the most dangerous conflicts for journalists. There's very little protection. They would go out to cover a story about some battle somewhere and they would simply never come back.
Swain's got an idea.
But Swain's got an idea. Now, all of this that's being shown, the drama of getting the water, the film, the bits and bobs, the dark room, the development of the photo, none of that happened. None at all. In reality, soon after they found out that the Cambodians had to go, these guys figured that they could use Swain's second passport, scrape off his picture with a razor blade, and replace it with a picture that they had of Pran. They used a gummy mixture of water and rice, and they were trying to pass Pran off as a Nepalese holder of a British passport. And that's why they felt that he would need to learn how to say John's full name on the passport, John Anquetil Brewer, correctly. But in Swain's book, he doesn't describe all of this drama. In the next paragraph, he says that soon after they handed the passport in, some solemn-looking officials come over and said that they had immediately noticed that it was a forgery. So, no dark room, no photo fading to black. That being said, at least the movie doesn't stray too far from the reality of the world it is depicting. The drama is believable within these circumstances and with these resources. But in between the scenes where Rockof and Swain attempt to get the photo to work, we do have a couple of things that I wanted to point out as well. So here, the Australian guy, he mentions that the water is out. This was the case, the water was no longer running by the 20th of April. Now, what those in the embassy didn't realise is that the water had been intentionally turned off by the Khmer Rouge. And I don't think it was a coincidence that it occurred the same day that Pol Pot arrived into Phnom Penh to begin planning out the next stages of the revolution, and perhaps was done to work in tandem with their attempts to get all of the Cambodians out of the embassy.
Excuse me, you Mr. Schamberg?
Yeah?
I've been told that you're in charge of the allocation of the bed covers.
What?
Blankets, we've just arrived.
Oh, yeah.
We want some blankets.
Yep.
Another thing that comes up is this slightly odd couple that approach Schamberg. Like, what's their deal? Well, it's not exactly clear, but my best guess is that this blasé couple might be a representation of a Shane Tar. which is a very Antipodean name, Shane. He was a 24-year-old from New Zealand, and he had a Cambodian wife. Now, there was also a French couple that could have been inspiration for this as well, but basically, they were Khmer Rouge supporters. They were Westerners who loved the Khmer Rouge and what they stood for, this communist revolution. And in the case of the French couple, they had actually gone out with the rest of the Cambodians to try and take part before basically being told, no thanks, you can go back to the embassy with the rest of the foreigners, thank you. Swain remembered the New Zealander, Shane, with particular spite. In his book, he basically says that he was constantly defending the Khmer Rouge, didn't do anything to help out around the embassy like everyone else was doing, but was first in line to, receive the meager bit of food that was being handed out.
Welcome to New York. We got it.
Perfect! Rockof, perfect!
In the film, before the forgery is detected, we have this Australian man saying, "Bung your passports here, you jokers, down to Mount Macedon to see the famous Hanging Rock." And I can confirm that this is 100% accurate, and we all speak like this all of the time.
All right, you jokers, would you like to bung your passports over to me? This is the last call for passports. Can I have your passports? Thank you. Can I have your passports? Thursday Island, right down to Mount Macedon to see the famous Hanging Rock. Come on, passports, please.
And we also have a shot outside of the embassy of some Khmer Rouge youths making a bit of a ruckus, being generally chaotic. This was reported in many of the different sources as well. And we get to see some pigs dropped off. The only difference here, as far as I can tell, is that they were alive when they were dropped off. And there are other stories about what those in the embassy would end up eating, but I actually won't trouble any of you with that because I can be upsetting for some people. But we also get another radio announcement.
No, but it does seem certain that the vast majority of Phnom Penh's population has been evacuated to the countryside. You see, the population was swollen with thousands of refugees.
Monsieur Swain, le consul vous fait passer cette note.
Bombing, so it's going to be argued by some that this is a way of coping with chaos, post-war chaos.
Dennis, can you...
Now this one is less easy to hear, but it does include some ideas about the evacuation and perhaps giving an excuse as to why it was being done, pointing out the effects of the Civil War and the American bombing. Much like the power struggles bit from before, I do have a slight issue with how the movie provides these excuses. This one again was used by the Khmer Rouge leadership to legitimize their evacuation of the city. But it was just that, it was an excuse. They really wanted to secure power for themselves and cleanse the city of any potential spy networks or enemies. The war and the bombing were horrible, but the bombing had ended 2 years earlier, and if it was concerns for the people in the city that meant they had to go to the countryside, well, perhaps it would have been done in a way that didn't kill up to 20,000 people. Perhaps they would have been provided with food and water on their way out of the city. Similarly, the easiest way to have fed these people, if the excuse was that they were going to starve, was to have kept them in the city and delivered the food to them there, where they were, instead of making them walk out into the countryside in the hottest month of the year. That the movie again gives the Khmer Rouge an excuse for what they were doing, and then again emphasizes this in a later scene in the movie via something that Schamberg says. This is what some historians have actually criticized about the film, and this slightly narrow focus that it does maintain.
Now listen, everybody. The trucks which we've seen arriving are for our evacuation. Probably in the next 24 hours. But listen, that's to be confirmed. It's almost certainly for Thailand.
Next, Swain explains that the trucks outside were imminently going to take them to Thailand. This would actually be communicated to the foreigners 5 days after the Cambodians had left, on the 25th of April, and the trucks, as I said before, eventually arrive on the 30th of April. The passport is shown as not having worked, and in the background we get this little argument between some people as they butcher the pigs, which involves a few people talking over each other. What they are saying is a little bit hard to hear, but it's basically examples of people questioning what the revolution was going to be, we hear someone say, well, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, which is what lots of revolutionaries say as they begin to kill people. But I suppose it is indicative of this somewhat mysterious moment that Cambodia was in right now, where no one really knew what was going to happen next. But for the movie, with the passport being found, we head for a tearful goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Give me these packing fellas.
Goodbye.
Don't forget.
For Christ's sake, Sidney, why didn't you get him out when you had the chance? You had no right to keep him here. Morgan, you've got a funny sense of priorities.
We have some harsh words for Schanberg, as he's accused of having kept Pran around too long, which, in my opinion, is kind of true. It was pretty irresponsible. Pran and Schanberg share this moment in the rain as he leaves toward an unknown fate. Now, accuracy-wise, you might be interested to know that it actually was raining. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, although it certainly helps that, but multiple memoirs recalled that it was raining that day, and it wasn't even just people in the embassy. For instance, Chan Sam-Wen in Prisoners of Class, his diary mentions the 20th of April and that there was a rain shower. So there you go. With that, the movie cuts and resumes a few months later in New York. But what happened to Pran? In the film, Pran is reintroduced working in an irrigation canal or dam work site in Democratic Kampuchea. But what had happened to him as he left the embassy? How did he manage to make it out? Well, given that in reality, he had snuck out amongst the many who left prior to Sirik Matak leaving, he was not under as much suspicion as the movie might have led you to assume. On the 20th, there were still people leaving the city, and he melded into those crowds, heading in a northerly direction. About 4 days later, he reached a town on a river. In the book, it is spelled Prek Dam. So I can't say 100%, but I believe it would probably be this town here. This is where the Khmer Rouge had set up a checkpoint to basically go through the biographies of people coming through. This was to weed out former military, government, or people with certain other backgrounds. He throws away his Western clothes, he puts on what amounts to a disguise, sort of short pants, a dirty shirt, sandals, and a kramar, and he also throws away the $2,000 that Schanberg had given him. While waiting, he meets a cameraman who worked for CBS named So Pan. He thought that the Khmer Rouge were probably going to employ him to work for them in the new regime, whereas Pran doesn't quite think so and distances himself from Sopan. He later found out that he was taken away and killed. Pran gets through the checkpoint by utilizing the same taxi driver persona that he adopts later in the film. Eventually, traveling toward his hometown of Siem Reap, he gets to the village of Dam Dek, and if you've ever taken the bus from Phnom Penh to Siem Reap, you've probably gone through this town. And there, he learns from some locals that further on, the Khmer Rouge are actually quite brutal. So he decides to basically post up here and lives in this village for the first couple of years of the revolution before moving on, and we'll explain that in the next video as well. Now, just one more thing I've noticed upon multiple watches of this film is that it will often portray Dith Pran as this somewhat meek character. For instance, in the embassy, the foreigners make a big fuss about not mentioning that the Cambodians must leave in front of him. It's like the adults going into a different room to discuss something where the child can't hear. It's a bit of a messy depiction, I feel. If anything, Pran is the one who knows what's going on all the time. That was his job. He was the people when journalists or whoever come to a country and they just need someone that knows how to do everything and contact everyone, basically a fixer, they go to someone like Dith Pran. And he knew lots of people, he was well loved, but he knew what was going on. As Schanberg himself says in the book, he had a kind of sixth sense for these things, and that was shown in the previous scenes where he helped them out of the abduction quite easily. He always knew what to do, and this was no different. So showing him kind of not knowing what was going on, needing the foreigners more than they needed him, I think also gets at this slightly Western focus the movie takes, which has also come under some criticism from historians. So that brings us to the end of what the film shows us, and compared to The Fall of Phnom Penh, there were a few more liberties taken in upping the drama and changing things from the real story. But overall, it depicts the situation pretty well. The emotion, the desperation, and aside from those sequential changes and the drama with the photograph, it is about as much as you could reasonably ask for in terms of accuracy. However, I feel that if it had actually kept to the real story even closer, you really wouldn't have missed out on any drama. For instance, we could have had a scene where Rockof heard gunshots coming from the direction of the nearby stadium, something he spoke about in his Khmer Rouge tribunal testimony. That would have added an extra amount of foreboding for what awaited the Cambodians who left. Similarly, Swain wrote about watching an ad hoc operation done on a Cambodian soldier in the dining room of the embassy. He eventually hemorrhaged and died in front of his wife and all of these other people watching. It was haunting. We could have also seen what happened to the foreigners after the Cambodians left, the desperate, smelly state that they lived in, as well as the 3-day journey on the truck to Thailand. They saw the empty city of Phnom Penh, as well as towns further out that had been emptied of their people, and they sort of realised that it hadn't just been Phnom Penh, it was sort of the entire country had got that treatment. They also saw dead bodies along the road at points, and Rockof recalled that he could even smell death coming from the distance if the wind was blowing just right. And we also could have had more interactions between, say, the French and the Khmer Rouge officials they were speaking with, which was something that was missed out on in the last part as well, where we could have had a few scenes speaking with the Khmer Rouge officials and knowing that they weren't just all children screwing around. We could have got the sense that they were a proper movement with some organisation, as brutal as they were. It would have been interesting to see them pretending to be polite and nice and saying how glorious their revolution was going to be, how safe everyone was going to be. And then that would be juxtaposed with what happens later in the film, where we see how horrible their vision for society actually turned out to be. And I feel like some of these scenes could have been included instead of the fake drama with the photograph. And if nothing else, that personally offended the real Al Rockof, who felt that it was insult to his skills as a photographer. He also has a lot to say about the portrayal of himself and, say, someone like Schamberg, who he thinks gets a much better version than the real one. He points to the fact that Schamberg had threatened that he would never get his photos in the New York Times again, because when they were leaving the embassy, there were multiple convoys. And Schamberg was leaving on the first convoy, and he said, hey, give me your extra rolls of film and I'll be able to use them. Rockof said, no, I'm contracted to Newsweek, so whatever, they don't want, you can have. And Schamberg said, well, good luck ever getting in the New York Times again, bud. Which sort of points to him not quite being the personality that we see on screen, at least. And the real Schamberg did actually comment to the filmmakers that he got a rather nice touch in this version of him that's put on screen. But overall, for this part of the movie, accuracy-wise, to give it another made-up accuracy score, I give this one a B-. Next time, we'll be talking about how the film depicts democratic Kampuchea, as well as the biographical details of Dith Pran and Hang Nyor. Now, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, this kind of deep dive into this history, and if you aren't aware, I've been making a podcast for the last 6 years about Cambodian history, about the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge, so you can listen to that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to things. But either way, I'll see you next time. See you later.